When the disease finally came to Custer County, it moved faster than wildfire and burned just as completely. Within 72 hours, every commercial livestock operation within a 100-mile radius was under mandatory quarantine, their animals either cold or dying, their barns sealed with state-issued yellow tape. But while ranchers stood hollow-eyed beside empty pens watching their livelihoods vanish into mass graves, one woman opened the hidden door of a hillside structure nobody had taken seriously, revealing enough healthy breeding stock to rebuild what the entire county had lost. And the people who had spent 2 years calling her paranoid stood in her pasture with their hats in their hands, finally understanding the difference between eccentric and prepared. It started simply enough, the way most things do in small Montana towns where everyone watches everyone else's business like it's their own personal television show. Helen Driscoll, at 53, had worked cattle her entire life on the same land her grandfather homesteaded in 1924. 200 acres of rolling grassland pressed against pine forest, good water from a spring-fed creek, and enough flat ground for hay production to carry stock through brutal winters. She ran a small operation by modern standards, maybe 40 head of cattle, some chickens, a handful of heritage breed pigs people drove from 3 counties over to purchase. But in the spring of 2019, something shifted in Helen that nobody could quite explain. She hired contractors from Billings, not local crews, and had them cut into the south-facing hillside behind her main barn. Within weeks, heavy equipment carved deep into the slope while massive concrete forms went in, then steel reinforcement, then layers of insulation thick enough for a commercial freezer. The structure that emerged didn't look like a barn at all. It looked like a bunker with a curved roof designed to blend into the hillside itself, covered in soil and native grasses until it disappeared into the landscape. "She's building a doomsday shelter for cows," someone joked at the feed co-op, and the name stuck immediately. What made people uncomfortable wasn't just the scale of construction, but the obsessive attention to detail. Helen installed independent ventilation systems with intake vents disguised as natural rock formations. She ran dedicated water lines from the spring, bypassing all municipal connections. She built layered biosecurity airlocks at both entrances, with footbaths and equipment sterilization stations that seemed excessive for a small family ranch. And strangest of all, she landscaped the entire hillside so carefully that from a distance, the barn simply vanished, looking like nothing more than a natural slope covered in buffalo grass and wildflowers. What the hell is she preparing for? Wade Patterson asked loudly at the diner one morning, loud enough for half the town to hear. Wade ran the largest commercial cattle operation in the county, 500 head on lease land, all connected to the regional livestock network that made modern ranching profitable. Helen's husband had died 4 years earlier, and she'd never remarried, never explained herself much, never joined the Cattlemen's Association or participated in the social machinery that kept small towns running. That alone made her suspect. But this construction project pushed her from quietly odd into actively concerning. "Probably thinks the government's coming for her herd," someone else offered, drawing scattered laughter. But Helen ignored all of it. She moved her breeding stock into the hidden hillside barn in carefully managed groups, selecting only her healthiest animals, her best genetic lines. She installed equipment for isolated feed storage, for water testing, for waste management that didn't connect to anything outside the sealed structure. And when curious neighbors drove past trying to glimpse inside, they found gates locked and privacy barriers strategically placed to block sight lines. By autumn, Helen had effectively disappeared, most of her operation from public view. Her main barn sat partially empty. Her visible pastures held only a few cattle. And the hillside structure, now completely camouflaged beneath established grass and carefully planted shrubs, had become invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. The rumors intensified. Some people said she'd joined a survivalist cult. Others claimed she was hiding assets from the IRS. A few suggested she'd simply lost her mind after her husband's death and was building elaborate fantasies into the landscape. Helen's only response came one afternoon at the feed store when Wade confronted her directly. "You planning to tell anyone what you're really doing up there?" he asked, not quite joking. Helen looked at him with those steady gray eyes that never wavered. "Protecting what's mine from things people don't want to think about." "What things?" "The things that always come eventually," she said quietly, and walked out before he could ask anything else. That winter passed uneventfully. Then spring. The hidden barn remained sealed and silent while life in Custer County continued its predictable rhythms. Cattle prices fluctuated. Weather followed seasonal patterns. And slowly, people stopped talking about Helen Driscoll's strange Hillside project because nothing dramatic happened, and routine has a way of making even the unusual feel normal. Until the morning the state veterinarian's office issued an emergency alert about a confirmed case of highly pathogenic livestock disease detected at a commercial feedlot 1 county north. The kind of disease that didn't just kill animals. It erased entire agricultural economies overnight. And Helen, who hadn't said a word to anyone in town for months, quietly checked the biosecurity seals on her hidden barn and waited. The disease arrived in Custer County on a Tuesday, carried on a livestock truck that had passed through 3 infected regions without anyone knowing until it was already too late. By Wednesday morning, the state veterinarian stood in Wade Patterson's main barn watching his cattle show the first unmistakable symptoms: fever, respiratory distress, the kind of rapid deterioration that left no room for hope. By Thursday, mandatory quarantine orders sealed every major operation in the county, while diagnostic teams in hazmat suits moved barn to barn confirming what everyone already knew. The disease had spread beyond containment. Helen heard about it on the emergency radio frequency she monitored from her kitchen. She walked out to the Hillside barn in the cool morning air, unlocked the concealed entrance, and checked every system inside. Air filtration running clean. Water tested negative for contamination. Feed supplies uncompromised. Her animals, isolated for nearly 2 years inside the climate-controlled structure, showed no symptoms of anything except robust health. She locked it again and returned to the house as state vehicles began appearing on county roads. The culling started Friday. Mass graves dug by contractors and protective equipment, animals destroyed by the hundreds to create fire breaks against disease spread. The sound of it carried across the valley: trucks, machinery, the low persistent noise of catastrophe happening in slow motion. Wade Patterson lost everything in a single morning. 500 head, 2 generations of genetic selection, a decade of careful herd management erased before lunch. At the diner that weekend, the conversations had changed completely. No jokes, no gossip, just exhausted ranchers staring at coffee cups, calculating losses that would bankrupt most of them, wondering how you rebuild when the foundation itself has been destroyed. "We're done," Wade said to no one in particular. "Even if they lift quarantine next month, we've got nothing left to work with." Across the county, the math was brutal and identical. Breeding stock gone, replacement costs impossible, regional supply chains contaminated, and even if someone wanted to import clean animals from out of state, biosecurity protocols now made that process so expensive and complex that small operators couldn't afford it. Helen didn't go to town. She stayed on her land, maintaining her routines, while the disaster unfolded around her. And she waited, because she'd learned long ago that people only ask the right questions after they've run out of wrong answers. The knock came Sunday evening. Wade Patterson, standing on her porch, hat in his hands, looking 10 years older than he had the previous week. "Can we talk?" he asked quietly. Helen stepped aside and let him in. They sat at her kitchen table while late sun slanted through the windows. Wade didn't speak immediately. He looked at his hands, at the floor, anywhere except directly at her. "I need to ask you something," he finally said. "And I already know how it's going to sound." Helen waited. "That barn you built, the one everyone made jokes about." He swallowed hard. "Do you have clean animals in there?" Helen's expression didn't change. "Yes." Wade closed his eyes briefly. "How many?" "Enough." "Enough for what?" "Enough to rebuild if you're willing to do it right this time," Helen said evenly. The silence stretched out between them, filled with the weight of 2 years of mockery, of dismissal, of a town that had laughed instead of listening. "Why?" Wade asked, his voice rough. "Why did you prepare for this?" Helen stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the hillside that had everything she protected. "My grandfather survived the drought of '34 because he didn't depend on systems everyone else trusted. He kept reserve seed when neighbors sold everything. He maintained his own water when the irrigation districts failed." She turned back to Wade. "He taught me that survival isn't about being paranoid. It's about remembering that collapse always feels impossible. Until the morning it isn't." Wade's hands trembled slightly. "Helen, I don't have the money to buy breeding stock. None of us do. Even if you were willing to sell. I'm not selling, Helen interrupted. Wade's face fell. I'm lending, she continued. Breeding contracts. You take animals, you rebuild your herds, you return equivalent stock when you're stable again. Wade stared at her. Why would you do that? Because a county full of failed ranches doesn't help anyone, Helen said simply. And because spite isn't as useful as community, even when community showed up late. The next morning, Helen opened the hidden Hillside barn for the first time in front of witnesses. State veterinarians arrived first, running every diagnostic protocol available. Then county agricultural agents. Then ranchers who had spent 2 years laughing, now standing silent as the massive camouflaged doors swung open. Inside, under controlled lighting and perfect ventilation, Helen's carefully selected breeding stock moved calmly through clean pens. Cattle genetics that would have cost hundreds of thousands to replace on the open market. Heritage breed pigs that represented bloodlines nearly extinct in the region. Chickens producing fertile eggs from stock impossible to source commercially anymore. All of it healthy. All of it protected. All of it waiting. The rebuilding of Custer County didn't happen overnight, but it happened methodically, guided by the same careful planning Helen had used to prepare for disaster in the first place. Within a week of the state veterinarian certifying her Hillside barn as disease-free, Helen had drafted breeding contracts with 8 different ranchers, creating a network of genetic distribution that would restore the county's livestock population within 2 breeding cycles. But the contracts came with conditions that made some people uncomfortable, and that discomfort taught the final lesson Helen had been trying to demonstrate all along. Each rancher who accepted breeding stock had to implement biosecurity protocols on their own operations. Not suggestions, requirements. Independent water sources were possible. Isolated quarantine facilities for any new animals. Feed storage that prevented cross-contamination. Record-keeping systems that tracked animal health and movement. Some of the younger ranchers adapted quickly, understanding immediately what Helen was building. Others, like Wade Patterson, struggled against decades of habit. This is 3 times the work for the same output, Wade complained one morning, standing in Helen's kitchen reviewing facility plans she'd drawn up for his operation. It's 3 times the work to prevent total loss next time, Helen corrected, not looking up from the contract she was annotating. You can't afford to rebuild twice, Wade. None of us can. He stared at the plans, jaw tight. Then he signed anyway, because the alternative was bankruptcy and leaving land his family had worked since 1947. The first breeding groups left Helen's Hillside barn in carefully orchestrated movements. Each animal health tested, documented, transported and sterilized trailers to ranches that had passed Helen's personal inspection. She didn't trust state protocols alone. She walked every property herself, checked every barn, asked questions that made people defensive until they realized she was protecting their investment as much as her own. By late autumn, the first calves from Helen's breeding stock were born across the county. Strong, healthy animals that carried genetics superior to what most ranchers had lost. And something unexpected began happening. Ranchers started talking to each other differently, sharing information about disease prevention, coordinating on biosecurity measures, building the kind of cooperative resilience that had existed in the county decades earlier, before industrial agriculture made everyone compete instead of collaborate. The State Agricultural Extension Office noticed. So did regional livestock associations. By the following spring, Helen received calls from counties across Montana asking about her Hillside barn design, her biosecurity systems, her breeding contract model. She answered every question with the same patient detail she'd used building the structure itself, never claiming credit, just explaining what worked. One afternoon, a reporter from the Billings newspaper arrived asking for an interview about the woman who saved Custer County's cattle industry. Helen refused the interview, but walked the reporter to the Hillside barn anyway. They stood outside the camouflaged entrance while meadowlarks called across the grassland and cattle grazed in the distance. Cattle that existed because of what Helen had protected. People keep saying you predicted this disease outbreak, the reporter said. That you somehow knew it was coming. Helen shook her head. I didn't predict anything specific. I just understood that systems fail. Always have. Always will. And the people who survive aren't the ones who trust systems completely. They're the ones who build alternatives before they're needed. Do you feel vindicated? the reporter pressed. After everything people said about you? Helen considered that. I feel tired, she said honestly. And I feel grateful we had options when everything collapsed. Vindication isn't useful. Preparation is. By the third year after the outbreak, Custer County's livestock numbers had recovered to 70% of pre-disease levels. More importantly, the county now had distributed resilience instead of concentrated vulnerability. Ranchers maintained emergency reserves. Breeding stock existed in multiple isolated locations. Information sharing had become standard practice instead of competitive secrecy. Helen's Hillside barn remained operational, but she'd begun transitioning some animals back to traditional facilities as the county's biosecurity infrastructure improved. The hidden structure would stay, though, a permanent reserve, a genetic backup, a reminder built into the landscape itself. One evening, Wade Patterson knocked on Helen's door carrying a bottle of whiskey and an expression that suggested he'd been rehearsing what to say. I owe you an apology, he said when Helen answered. A real one. For every joke, every time I made you feel crazy for caring about things I was too comfortable to think about. Helen invited him in. They sat on the porch while the sun set over the hills, painting the grassland gold. I spent my whole life trusting that things would work the way they always had. Wade continued quietly. That if something went wrong, someone else would fix it. You didn't trust that. And you were right. Helen sipped her coffee. I wasn't right about everything. I was just careful about the things that mattered most. Your husband, Wade said carefully. Did he understand what you were building before he died? Helen smiled faintly. He called up my insurance policy. Said I thought like someone who'd lived through the Depression, even though I was born 40 years too late. She paused. But he helped me plan it anyway. He understood that loving someone means protecting what they can't afford to lose. They sat in comfortable silence while darkness gathered and stars began appearing overhead. Somewhere down the valley, cattle lowed softly. Normal sounds. Safe sounds. Sounds that almost hadn't survived. What's next for you? Wade asked eventually. Helen looked toward the Hillside barn. Invisible now in the darkness except for the faint ventilation glow someone would only notice if they knew to look for it. Same thing as always, she said. Taking care of what's here. Preparing for what might come. And hoping that next time something breaks, we're all a little more ready than we were before. Wade nodded slowly. Then he raised his glass toward the hidden barn that had saved them all. To being ready, he said. Helen touched her cup to his glass. To remembering that ready matters most before you need it. And out on the hillside, behind its camouflaged doors and layered biosecurity, Helen's carefully protected livestock rested quietly in the dark. A living reserve, a genetic lifeline, a testament to the quiet dignity of preparing for disasters that everyone else believed would never come.